The rain in Seoul didn't just fall, it punished. Kiara and Dilavu huddled against a damp brick wall, her shivering frame draped in a filthy, oversized hoodie that had long ago lost its warmth. At 20 years old, she was a ghost in a city of neon lights, surviving on the plastic she scavenged and the scraps of mercy left by strangers. For 15 years, she had carried the hollow ache of the day her mother told her to wait on a street corner and never came back. To her mother, Kiara was a burden. To the world, she was invisible. Until the splashing of tires through a puddle stopped directly in front of her. A black luxury sedan, sleek and predatory, sat idling in the dark. The door opened, and Jang Hyun-woo stepped out. He was a titan of the underworld, a man whose name was whispered in fear across the peninsula. His white dress shirt was already clinging to his powerful, muscular chest, and as he knelt in the grime, completely ignoring the ruin of his $1,000 suit, the massive dragon tattoo on his forearm flexed with a life of its own. Kiara held out a trembling hand, expecting a few coins and a look of disgust. Instead, she felt the warmth of his large, steady palm cradling her face. "You've spent long enough in the dirt," he murmured, his dark eyes burning with a sudden, controlled compassion. "It's time you saw what it feels like to rule the city that tried to bury you." Kiara expected a shelter. She didn't expect a kingdom. But as the dragon of Seoul pulled her into the dry sanctuary of his car, she had no idea that her mother was watching from the shadows of the past, and that her rescue was about to ignite a war that would shock the entire nation. "Hello, family. How are you doing? Nice to have you here. Before we proceed, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments section and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here." Now let's dive into the story. The scent of gasoline and stagnant water was the only world Kiara and Dilavu knew. She sat tucked into the jagged corner of an alleyway, her body pressed against a stack of wet cardboard that had become her bed, her dining table, and her shield. The Seoul rain was a relentless, icy curtain that soaked through her threadbare hoodie, turning her deep brown skin ash-gray with cold. At 20, she looked like a broken porcelain doll discarded in the mud, her long, curly hair matted with the grit of a city that had spent 15 years trying to erase her existence. Every footstep that splashed nearby made her flinch. She had learned early on that the world didn't see a girl in need. It saw a nuisance. People looked at her the way her mother, Helen, had, as a burden that took up too much space and offered too little value. Kiara closed her eyes, clutching a half-empty bag of plastic bottles she had spent all day collecting, a meager harvest that wouldn't even buy her a warm bun. She began to cry, the silent, shaking kind of sobs that come when hope has finally been starved out. Then the world went quiet. The heavy drumming of rain on the trash bins was suddenly muffled by the presence of something massive and still. A pair of polished black leather shoes appeared in her blurred vision, standing defiantly in the puddle beside her cardboard sanctuary. Kiara didn't look up. She simply extended a trembling, muddy hand, her fingers curled into a cup. "Please," she whispered, her voice a brittle rasp. "Anything helps." She expected the metallic clink of a coin, or more likely, the splash of a shoe walking away. Instead, the air grew warm. A shadow fell over her, blocking the wind. Jang Hyun-woo, a man whose very name could stop a heart in the high-rises above, knelt in the grime. He didn't care that the wet concrete was ruining his custom-tailored trousers or that the splashing mud was staining his pristine white dress shirt. He moved with a heavy, magnetic grace, his broad shoulders shielding her from the downpour. Kiara's breath hitched as she finally looked up. His face was a masterpiece of ruthless angles, a defined jawline, a sharp nose, and eyes so dark and intense they seemed to hold the weight of the entire underworld. But as he looked at her, the lethal coldness in his expression fractured. "Stop," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command that vibrated in the small of her back. He didn't drop money into her hand. Instead, he reached out, his large, warm fingers gently cradling her chin. His thumb brushed a tear from her cheek, the skin-to-skin contact sending a jolt through Kiara's frozen system. For the first time since she was 5 years old, someone was touching her as if she were made of something precious, not something discarded. "I don't want your money," Kiara stammered, her wide, emotional eyes searching his. I just wanted to eat." "You will never be hungry again," Hyun-woo replied. His voice was a low baritone, thick with a sudden, controlled compassion. He looked at her tattered clothes, her shaking limbs, and the fierce intelligence shimmering behind her fear. He saw the gem beneath the dust, the resilience that had kept her alive in a world that had given her nothing. The dragon tattoo on his forearm flexed as he shifted his weight, the intricate ink looking like a guardian coiling around them both. Without a word of warning, he slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. Kiara let out a small gasp of disbelief as he lifted her effortlessly. She felt tiny in his arms, her head falling instinctively against his muscular chest. She could hear the steady, powerful thrum of his heart through the thin silk of his shirt. He carried her out of the shadows and toward the idling black sedan, his stride certain and dominant. The driver hurried to open the rear door, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. Hyun-woo ignored the gesture, his focus entirely on the fragile girl in his arms. He settled her into the plush, heated leather of the backseat, a world of scentless air and silent luxury that Kiara didn't know existed. As he sat beside her and the heavy door shut with a solid, expensive thud, the city's chaos vanished. Kiara stared at her muddy hands against the cream-colored upholstery, her body still trembling from the shock of the transition. She looked at the man beside her, this dragon who had ruined a fortune in clothes just to pull her out of the dirt. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice small against the hum of the engine. Hyun-woo turned his head, his dark gaze locking onto hers. "I am the man who is going to make sure the world regrets every tear you've shed tonight." The car glided forward, leaving the alleyway behind forever. Kiara didn't know where they were going, but as the heat of the car began to thaw her bones, she realized the burden had finally been claimed. The private elevator ascended in a silence so thick it felt pressurized. Kiara sat huddled on the edge of the velvet bench, her wet clothes dripping onto the polished chrome floor, a stark reminder of the world she had just left behind. When the doors slid open, she was met with a vista of glass and obsidian. The penthouse was a sprawling sanctuary of light and shadows, perched so high that the rain-streaked skyscrapers of Seoul looked like glowing toys below. Hyun-woo didn't summon a fleet of servants to handle her. He guided her himself toward a bathroom larger than the entire alleyway she had called home. "The water is already warm," he said, his voice dropping to a low, steady hum. "There are clothes on the counter. Cleanse the street from your skin, Kiara. No one can touch you here." When Kiara emerged an hour later, she felt like a different person. The grime that had felt like a second skin for 15 years was gone, replaced by the scent of expensive soap and the softness of an oversized cashmere sweater she'd found waiting for her. Her curls, freed from the knots and dirt, framed a face that possessed a haunting, delicate beauty. She walked into the dining area, where a spread of steaming food, rich bone broth, grilled meats, and jasmine rice, filled the air with a scent so heavenly it made her dizzy. Hyun-woo was sitting at the head of a long marble table, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dragon coiling around his arm. He watched her approach with an unreadable expression, his dark eyes tracking her every movement. He gestured to the chair beside him. As she ate, slowly at first, then with a desperate hunger she couldn't hide, Hyun-woo didn't press her. He waited until she set her spoon down, her cheeks finally holding a hint of color. "Tell me," he said softly, "how does a girl with eyes like yours end up sleeping on cardboard?" Kiara looked at the steam rising from her tea. She didn't cry this time. The coldness of the street had forged a steel core inside her that was finally starting to show. "I was 5, she began, her voice steady and hauntingly composed. "My father left us and my mother. Helen decided I was the reason her life was falling apart. She told me I was a burden, a heavy weight she couldn't carry anymore." She looked directly at him, and Hyun-woo was struck by the sheer clarity in her gaze. There was no self-pity there, only a chillingly logical understanding of her own tragedy. "She told me we were going to a festival. She bought me a piece of candy and told me to wait by the red gate while she went to find my father. I waited for 3 days. By the time I realized she wasn't coming back, I had already learned my first lesson. If you want to breathe, you have to find your own air." She narrated her survival not as a victim, but as a strategist. She explained how she had mapped the city's recycling routes to maximize her earnings, how she had learned to read people's intentions by the sound of their footsteps, and how she had taught herself to calculate the fluctuating prices of plastic and scrap metal to ensure she never went 2 days without a meal. I wasn't just begging, she said, a spark of defiant pride in her eyes. I was managing a deficit. I knew which districts were safe during the monsoon and which alleys the police ignored. I survived because I learned the architecture of the city better than the people who built it. Hyun-woo leaned back, his gaze narrowing. He had expected a broken girl who needed constant care. Instead, he found a brilliant mind that had been sharpened in the harshest forge on earth. Her composure was terrifyingly elegant. She spoke with the vocabulary of an intellectual and the grit of a soldier. She was a woman who had been stripped of everything and had used the debris to build a fortress. "You're a rare gem, Kiara," he murmured, the words vibrating with a newfound respect. "Most people would have been crushed by that weight. You used it to turn your heart into a diamond." He realized then that the girl sitting in his penthouse wasn't a charity case. She was a tactical asset, a spirit so resilient that she could navigate the treacherous world of the Jang Syndicate without blinking. She had survived the streets of Seoul for 15 years with nothing. He could only imagine what she could do with his empire behind her. "Your mother was wrong," Hyun-woo said, his voice turning dark and lethal. "You weren't a burden. You were the only thing of value she ever had, and she was too small of a person to see it." Kiara looked at him, her vulnerability momentarily peeking through the steel. "And what do you see, Chairman?" Hyun-woo stood up, walking around the table until he was standing directly over her. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I see a queen who has been wandering in the dark, and I think it's time you had a throne." The silence of the penthouse was no longer the hollow, frightening quiet of the streets. It was a heavy, velvet stillness that seemed to wait for the world to change. Kiara sat in the oversized cashmere sweater, her small frame swallowed by the luxury of the chair, watching Hyun-woo as he paced the length of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights of Seoul blurred behind him, a sea of neon that he seemed to hold in the palm of his hand. He stopped turning and looked at her, the dragon on his arm catching the amber glow of the chandelier. "My life is not what it appears to be on the news, Kiara," he began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "I am a man with many enemies. The men who work for me stay because they fear me. The women who try to get close to me stay because they want the power my name provides. But none of them possess what you have." Kiara tilted her head, her dark eyes reflecting his intensity. "And what is that? I have nothing but the clothes you gave me." "You have the iron will of someone who has stared at death and refused to blink," Hyun-woo said, stepping closer until he stood directly over her. "In my world, loyalty is a rare currency, and resilience is the only thing that keeps you alive. I don't need a socialite who wilts when the wind blows. I need someone who can stand beside me when the shadows close in. Someone who knows that survival is a choice." He knelt before her, just as he had in the rain, but this time his expression wasn't one of comfort. It was a formal, chillingly serious proposition. He took her hand, her small, brown hand that still bore the faint scars of 15 years of scavenging, and held it with a reverence that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "I am offering you a contract, Kiara, not of employment but of life. I want you to be my wife. I will give you my name, my protection, and a life of luxury that will make the people who ignored you on the street look like ants. You will never have to search for food or warmth again. In return, you will be my partner, my queen." Kiara felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She began to tremble, the shock radiating from her fingertips. "Marriage," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "Chairman, you don't even know me. I am a street girl. I was a beggar. People will laugh at you. Your enemies will use me to hurt you." "Let them try," Hyun-woo hissed, his grip on her hand tightening just enough to ground her. "The world thinks you were a burden. I see you as the only person in this city worthy of the Jang throne. I don't care where you came from. I care about the fire I see in your eyes. I want to give you the world, Kiara. Not because I pity you, but because I believe you are the only one capable of ruling it with me." Kiara looked at him, searching for a lie, a prank, or the cruel trickery her mother had used to abandon her. But she found only the steady, unblinking truth of a man who had seen the darkest corners of humanity and recognized a kindred spirit. For 15 years, she had been a ghost, a girl waiting for a mother who never came. Now, a king was kneeling before her, offering her a crown. "If I say yes," she stammered, tears of disbelief finally pricking her eyes, "I can never go back, can I?" "There is no going back to the dark," Hyun-woo promised, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. "From this moment on, your past is buried. You will be Kiara Jang, and anyone who dares to look down on you will have to answer to the dragon." The weight of the choice settled in her chest. She looked at the scars on her hands, and then at the powerful man who saw them as badges of honor. She thought of the cold cardboard and the rain, and then she looked into the burning, protective eyes of Jang Hyunwoo. With a shaky breath, Kiara closed her hand over his. "Yes," she breathed, her voice gaining a sudden, newfound strength. "I accept." Hyunwoo didn't smile, but a flash of triumph crossed his face. He stood, pulling her up with him until she was flush against his chest. He pressed a firm, possessive kiss to her forehead, a silent vow that the girl from the street was gone. In her place stood the woman who would soon make the entire city of Seoul tremble. 1 year later, the city of Seoul did not just recognize the name Kiara Jang, it bowed to it. The transformation was not merely a matter of silk gowns and diamond chokers, but a radical reconstruction of a soul that had once been left for dead. Kiara stood in the center of a palatial dressing room, her reflection framed by gold-leafed mirrors. The hollow-cheeked girl in the oversized hoodie had vanished, replaced by a woman whose deep brown skin glowed with health, and whose long, dark curls were now styled with the precision of a crown. She wore a tailored suit of cream-colored wool, the sharp lines reflecting the razor-edged intellect she had once used just to find a meal. Every movement was poised, every gesture calculated. She had spent 12 months studying the intricacies of international trade, the nuances of the Jang Syndicate's legitimate holdings, and the brutal social hierarchy of the Korean elite. She hadn't just learned to survive in Hyunwoo's world, she had mastered it. The heavy mahogany doors opened, and Hyunwoo stepped in. He had traded his white dress shirt for a charcoal tuxedo, his presence as commanding as ever. He stopped behind her, his dark eyes meeting hers in the mirror. Without a word, he reached out, his large hands resting on her shoulders. The dragon tattoo on his forearm was partially visible beneath his cuff, a reminder of the power that anchored her life. "The press is waiting, Kiara," he murmured, his voice thick with a pride that he reserved only for her. "The entire country wants to hear from the woman who turned the Jang Group's charitable wing into a multi-billion-dollar foundation in 6 months." Kiara turned in his arms, her hands resting against his chest. The fear that had once defined her had been replaced by a fierce, unwavering devotion. "They don't want to hear about the foundation, Hyunwoo. They want to see if the girl from the streets finally tripped over her own feet." Hyunwoo leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "You haven't tripped once. You've outpaced them all." He pressed a lingering, possessive kiss to her temple. "You are the only person I trust with my name. Never forget that." Moments later, they stepped onto the podium of a grand ballroom for a televised press conference. The air was thick with the blinding flash of cameras and the frantic scratching of pens. Kiara stood before a sea of reporters, her voice steady and resonant as she spoke about her initiatives for urban renewal and the protection of the city's vulnerable populations. She spoke with the authority of someone who had lived the struggle and the grace of someone who had transcended it. She was the most famous woman in the country, the queen of the underworld, who had become the nation's sweetheart. Miles away, in a cramped, sun-bleached apartment that smelled of stale cigarettes and regret, Helen David sat on a sagging sofa. Her eyes were fixed on the flickering 70-inch television screen she could barely afford. She had remarried a man who was as bitter as she was, and her life had become a dull cycle of resentment. Helen leaned forward, her heart skipping a beat as the camera zoomed in on the woman at the podium. The reporter's voice cut through the room. "Madam Kiara Jang, wife of Chairman Jang Hyunwoo, continues to lead the polls as the most influential woman in Seoul." Helen's breath hitched. She recognized those eyes. They were the same wide, emotional eyes that had looked up at her 15 years ago by the Red Gate. But the vulnerability was gone. The burden she had dumped in an alleyway was now draped in more wealth than Helen could imagine in 10 lifetimes. She watched as the most feared man in Korea stepped closer to the woman, placing a protective hand on her waist, his gaze full of an adoration that made Helen's skin crawl with a mix of shock and sudden, burning greed. "Kiara," Helen whispered, her fingers trembling as she touched the cold glass of the screen. That's my Kiara." She didn't feel remorse. She didn't feel the sting of a mother's guilt. Instead, as she watched her daughter handle a multi-billion-dollar empire with the flick of a wrist, a dark, opportunistic fire ignited in her chest. She had thrown away a pebble, only to realize a decade and a half later that she had discarded a diamond. Helen stood up, her mind already racing with the lies she would tell and the ways she would bridge the gap. She didn't see a daughter she loved. She saw a bank account with a face she could exploit. "She's a billionaire," Helen muttered to the empty room, a twisted smile spreading across her face. "And she owes me. After all, she wouldn't be there if I hadn't given her the chance to be found." The flickering blue light of the television was the only thing illuminating the cramped, cluttered living room of Helen David's apartment. The air was heavy with the smell of unwashed dishes and the cheap gin her second husband had left on the coffee table before stumbling out to the bars. Helen sat in a threadbare armchair, her eyes narrowing as a news special began to air. It was a retrospective on the Jang miracle, the rise of the most influential woman in South Korea. When the camera panned to a high-definition close-up of Kiara Jang, Helen froze. The glass she was holding slipped from her fingers, thudding onto the stained carpet. On the screen, Kiara was the picture of regal perfection. She was standing in front of a sleek glass building, the wind catching her silk scarf as she shook hands with a foreign dignitary. Beside her, Jang Hyun-woo stood like a dark sentinel, his possessive hand resting on the small of her back. The reporter's voice echoed through the room. "Madam Kiara Jang, whose mysterious origins have captivated the nation, has donated another 50 billion won to the city's youth shelters tonight." 50 billion, Helen whispered, her voice cracking. 50 billion. She scrambled off the chair, crawling closer to the screen until she was inches away from Kiara's radiant face. She studied the curve of the jaw, the natural glow of her deep brown skin, and the sharp, intelligent fire in those dark eyes. It was her. It was the burden she had left shivering by a red gate 15 years ago. A twisted knot of resentment and shock tightened in Helen's chest. For years, she had justified her abandonment by telling herself that the girl was better off dead or lost, that a child from a broken home was a weight that would only sink her further into the mud. She had moved on, changed her name, and remarried a man who provided nothing but more misery. And yet, here was the daughter she had discarded, ruling an empire from a literal throne of gold. But as the initial shock faded, a different emotion took root: predatory greed. Helen didn't think of the nights Kiara must have spent crying for her. She didn't think of the hunger or the cold cardboard. She saw the designer clothes, the private jets, and the lethal, billionaire husband. She saw a ticket out of her rotting apartment and away from the man who drank away her meager wages. "She's my flesh and blood," Helen muttered, her eyes gleaming with a feverish light. "She wouldn't even be in that palace if I hadn't let her go. She owes me. She's a billionaire because of me." She stood up, her mind racing with the speed of a cornered rat. She needed a plan. She couldn't just demand money, she had to play the part of the grieving, repentant mother. She looked at her reflection in a cracked hallway mirror. Her face was lined with bitterness, her hair dry and unkempt. It was perfect. She looked like a victim. She began to practice in the mirror, squeezing her eyes shut until they watered. "Kiara, my baby," she whispered, forcing her voice to tremble with a rehearsed sob. "I never wanted to leave you. I was so young, so scared. I've searched for you every day for 15 years. She wiped a fake tear away, a cold smile touching her lips when the reflection looked back at her with convincing sorrow. She knew how the world worked. If she went to the press or showed up at the Jang estate with a heart-wrenching story of a mother's forced sacrifice, Kiara would have to take her in to protect her public image. And once she was inside that penthouse, she would never have to worry about a bill again. Helen grabbed a pen and a scrap of paper from the counter, her hands shaking with excitement. She still had connections in the old neighborhood, people who knew how to find a phone number for a price. She would find her daughter. She would play the role of the century. "I'm coming for my share, Kiara," Helen hissed at the television, where her daughter was currently smiling at the man who had saved her. "Mother is coming home, and this time, you're the one who's going to take care of me." The private office of the Jang estate was a fortress of quiet elegance, a room of dark wood and soft leather that smelled of expensive ink and the faint, comforting scent of Hyun-woo's cologne. Kiara sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian, her eyes fixed on a glowing tablet as she reviewed the week's charitable allocations. The poise she carried now was a suit of armor, forged over a year of becoming the woman the world knew as Madame Zhang. When her private, encrypted phone vibrated on the desk, she didn't recognize the number. She hesitated, her survival instincts, the ones honed in the gutters of soul, prickling at the back of her neck. She tapped the screen and brought the phone to her ear. "Yes," she said, her voice a calm, melodic chime. "Kiara, is that really you?" The voice was like a ghost reaching out from a grave Kiara had spent 15 years digging. It was a voice she had once associated with the scent of cheap perfume and the sound of a closing gate. The poise Kiara had spent a year perfecting didn't break, but her blood turned to liquid ice in her veins. "Who is this?" Kiara asked, though she already knew. A ragged, wet sob erupted on the other end of the line. "It's me, baby. It's your mother. It's Helen. Oh, Kiara, I've been searching for you for so long. When I saw you on the news, I thought my heart would stop. I never stopped loving you, Kiara. I was so young, so broken when your father left us. I thought I was protecting you by leaving you where someone better could find you." The lies were so thick they were suffocating. Kiara stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the sprawling gardens. She watched her husband, Hyun Woo, in the distance, speaking with his security team. His presence was a reminder of what real protection looked like. "Someone better did find me," Kiara said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, hollow whisper. "But it wasn't because of you, Helen. It was in spite of you." "Kiara, please." Helen's voice shifted, the desperation becoming more apparent. "I'm in a bad way. I've suffered so much since that day. Seeing you so happy, so successful, it's all I ever wanted. I just want to see you. I want to be a family again, a mother and her daughter." "Family?" Kiara let out a soft, sharp laugh that held no humor. "You didn't want a family when I was 5 years old and shivering because the candy you bought me to keep me quiet had run out. You didn't want a family when I was sleeping on cardboard and eating scraps. You want a bank account. You saw the diamonds on my neck and the chairman by my side, and you realized the burden you threw away became a gold mine." "How can you be so cold?" Helen shrieked, the mask of the grieving mother beginning to slip. "I gave you life. You owe me everything." Kiara closed her eyes, remembering the red gate, the feeling of her small hand slipping out of Helen's, and the way the world had felt so impossibly large and terrifying. She remembered the moment she stopped waiting. "You didn't give me life," Kiara said, her tone becoming as sharp and absolute as a guillotine. "You gave me an ending, but the girl you left in that alley died a long time ago. She died of hunger, of cold, and of a broken heart. The woman you are speaking to now was born from the dirt you left her in. She was built by a man who saw value in her when her own mother saw trash." "Kiara, listen to me." "No, you listen," Kiara interrupted, her eyes hardening until they were as black as the obsidian desk. "My mother is dead, Helen. She died 15 years ago on a street corner in Seoul. I don't know who you are, but you are a stranger to me. If you ever call this number again, or if you even breathe in the direction of my husband's estate, I will show you exactly what happens when you try to exploit the wife of the dragon." "You wouldn't dare," Helen hissed, her voice now jagged with pure, unadulterated greed. "I'll go to the press. I'll tell them what a heartless monster you are." "Go ahead," Kiara replied coolly. "But remember who owns the press in this city. You'll be back on your street corner before the sun sets." Without waiting for a response, Kiara pulled the phone from her ear and pressed the end call button. She stood there for a long moment, her chest rising and falling in steady, rhythmic breaths. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply deleted the call log and set the phone back on the desk. The past had tried to reclaim her, but she was no longer a ghost. She was a queen. Downstairs, Helen David threw her phone against the wall of her rotting apartment, letting out a primal scream of rage. The billionaire life she had envisioned was slipping through her fingers, and as she looked at her empty cupboards and her bruised reflection, her desperation turned into a dark, lethal plan. If Kiara wouldn't give her the money out of love, she would make her pay for it in blood. The rejection had curdled Helen David's greed into a volatile, toxic rage. If Kiara would not play the part of the dutiful daughter, she would play the part of the ultimate victim. In a dark corner of a smoke-filled gambling den on the outskirts of Seoul, Helen sat across from two men whose faces were maps of scars and bad intentions. She had emptied her meager savings to buy their silence and their strength. "I don't want her dead," Helen hissed, her voice vibrating with a feverish intensity. I want her scared, and I want her husband's bank account drained. He's a monster, but even monsters pay to keep their toys. The plan was a masterclass in desperation. Helen knew that if Hyun-woo even suspected her involvement, he would erase her from existence before she could blink. To survive, she had to become someone else. She traded her floral dresses for heavy, oversized tactical layers and a thick, dark parka that obscured her frame. She bound her hair tightly under a skull cap and used a high-end voice modulator she'd acquired through her husband's shady connections. A device that transformed her shrill, bitter voice into a low, metallic growl that sounded like a man who had swallowed glass. The opportunity arrived during a gala for the Jang Foundation. Kiara was at her most radiant, a vision in shimmering bronze silk as she stepped out of the grand ballroom for a moment of quiet on the darkened terrace. She was shielded by the night, or so she thought. The attack was swift and clinical. Before Kiara could scream, a cloth soaked in a sweet, chemical scent was pressed against her face. The world tilted, the stars over Seoul spinning into a blur of gray, and the last thing she felt was the rough grip of gloved hands dragging her into the shadows of a waiting van. When Kiara woke, she was in a place that smelled of rust and damp concrete, a haunting echo of the alleyways of her childhood. Her hands were zip-tied behind her, and her bronze gown was stained with the grit of a warehouse floor. A figure emerged from the shadows, draped in heavy, dark clothing that made them look like a shapeless specter. The person moved with a strange, agitated energy, stopping just out of the light. "You should have been nicer to your mother, Kiara," a voice growled, a deep, electronic rumble that made Kiara's skin crawl. Kiara blinked, her head throbbing. She looked up at the disguised figure, her eyes narrowing with a sharp, survivalist instinct. "Who are you? If it's money you want, you've just signed your death warrant. My husband will find you." "He'll find me when I have my billions," the voice buzzed. "Until then, you're just a very expensive piece of bait." Miles away in the heart of the Jang estate, the air had turned lethal. Hyun-woo stood in his command center, his face a mask of such terrifying stillness that even his most seasoned guards were afraid to breathe. On the monitor before him, a video message played on a loop. It showed Kiara, bound and pale, while a disguised man in a heavy parka stood behind her. 100 billion won, the distorted voice demanded from the speakers. "No police, no games. If the money isn't at the drop point by dawn, the Queen of Seoul goes back to the gutter. In a box." Hyun-woo didn't shout. He didn't break the glass. He simply reached down and slowly unbuttoned his cuffs, rolling up his sleeves to reveal the full, coiled power of the dragon tattoo. The controlled compassion he had cultivated for Kiara had evaporated, leaving behind the raw, primal predator that had built the syndicate. "T1, Hyun-woo said, his voice a low, guttural vibration that promised a bloodbath. "Bring me the thermal trackers and the satellite feed for the old industrial district, and prepare the men." "Sir," T1 asked, checking his weapon. "I'm not going there to pay a ransom," Hyun-woo replied, his eyes burning with a cold, demonic light. "I'm going there to remind this city why the dragon is the only god they should fear. Whoever touched her is going to pray for a death I won't give them." In the cold warehouse, Helen watched Kiara from behind her mask, her heart racing with a mixture of terror and triumph. She thought she was the predator, but as the distant sound of a high-performance engine roared through the night, she had no idea that she had just invited a hurricane through her front door. The industrial district of Seoul felt like a graveyard of rusted iron and shattered glass, but tonight it was a hunting ground. The silence of the warehouse district was obliterated by the screech of high-performance tires as a fleet of black SUVs tore through the fog. Jang Hyun-woo didn't wait for his men to breach the perimeter. He stepped out of his car before it had even fully stopped, his white dress shirt stark against the darkness, his eyes reflecting a lethal, cold fire that promised no survivors. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the smell of motor oil and fear. Two thugs, hired for their brawn and lack of questions, stood guard near the center of the room. They never saw the shadow that disconnected itself from the rafters. With a movement so swift it was almost invisible, Hyun-woo moved between them. He didn't use a gun. He used the raw, ruthless violence that had made him a legend. A sickening crack of bone followed a precision strike to the first man's temple. while the second was sent flying into a stack of metal crates by a kick that carried the weight of a freight train. Hyun-woo stood over the fallen men, his chest heaving slightly, the dragon tattoo on his arm appearing to writhe in the flickering overhead light. He didn't look back as his tactical team swarmed the building to secure the exits. His focus was entirely on the small, elevated office at the back of the floor, the place where his queen was being held. "Kiara," his voice roared, a guttural sound that shook the very foundations of the building. Inside the office, the disguised figure panicked. Helen, still draped in her heavy parka and skull cap, scrambled to grab a rusted pipe, her electronic voice modulator emitting a frantic, distorted hiss. Kiara, tied to a chair with her mouth taped, watched the door with wide eyes. She heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and full of vengeance. The office door didn't just open, it was kicked off its hinges. Hyun-woo stepped into the room, his presence so overwhelming that the air seemed to vanish. He saw Kiara, saw the tape on her mouth and the bruises forming on her wrists, and something inside him snapped. He moved toward the disguised kidnapper like a tidal wave. Helen swung the pipe with a desperate, shaky hand, but Hyun-woo caught it midair with one hand, his grip crushing the metal. He wrenched the weapon away and threw it aside, his other hand reaching out to seize the leader by the throat. He slammed the figure against the concrete wall, lifting them off their feet. "You touched her," Hyun-woo hissed, his face inches from the black mask. "I told the world she was untouchable, and you thought I was joking." His hand tightened, his knuckles white. He reached for the tactical knife sheathed at his belt, the blade gleaming with a hungry light. He was a second away from ending the life of the person who had dared to harm his wife. He wanted to feel the life fade out of this shadow. "Stop!" Kiara's muffled voice struggled behind the tape. Hyun-woo's eyes flickered to Kiara for a fraction of a second, but his rage was a runaway train. He looked back at the kidnapper, his thumb catching the edge of the mask. "Let's see what kind of monster hides behind a machine," he growled. With a violent jerk, he ripped the mask and the skull cap away. The leader gasped for air, her face pale and contorted with terror. Graying hair tumbled down, and the harsh fluorescent light revealed the features of a woman who looked far older than her years, a woman whose eyes were wide with the realization that she was about to die. Hyun-woo froze, the knife inches from her throat. He didn't recognize her, but the sudden, strangled sob that escaped Kiara's throat told him everything he needed to know. "Helen," Kiara whispered, the tape having been partially loosened in her struggle. Her voice was filled with a mixture of horror and a sickening lack of surprise. Hyun-woo stepped back, his hand dropping as if he had been burned. He looked at the trembling, pathetic woman pinned against the wall, the mother who had abandoned her daughter at 5, only to return 15 years later to kidnap her for a paycheck. The dragon didn't feel triumph. He felt a profound, cold disgust that made the violence in his blood turn to ice. Helen slid down the wall, her legs giving out, the electronic modulator still strapped to her neck, making her pathetic whimpers sound like a broken machine. It was for the money," she choked out, her true voice cracking through the distortion. "You have so much. She owes me." Hyun-woo turned away from her, his stomach churning. He walked to Kiara, his hands remarkably steady as he sliced through her zip ties and pulled her into his arms. He shielded her face from the sight of the woman on the floor, tucking her head into the hollow of his neck. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice returning to the soft, protective tone he used only for her. "I have you." But as Kiara clung to him, her eyes remained fixed on the woman who had birthed her and then tried to sell her. The shadows of the warehouse were long, but for the first time, the light was beginning to show the path toward a final, legal justice. The heavy silence that followed the unmasking was more suffocating than the damp air of the warehouse. Helen huddled on the floor, a pathetic heap of dark fabric and broken greed, her eyes darting between the man who looked like a god of war and the daughter she had treated like a discarded toy. She tried to crawl toward Kiara, her hands reaching out in a mock gesture of maternal pleading. "Kiara, baby, listen to me," Helen wheezed, the voice modulator still dangling from her neck like a parasitic throat. "It was the thugs. They forced me. I just wanted to be with you. I wanted to protect you from this monster." Hyun-woo's hand tightened on the hilt of his blade, his knuckles turning white. The sheer audacity of her lies was an insult to the air they breathed. He looked down at Helen, and for a moment, the predatory darkness in his gaze flared so bright that the woman shrieked and shielded her face. He could have ended it in a heartbeat. He could have made her disappear into the foundation of a bridge, ensuring no one would ever hear her voice again. But then he felt the small, steady pressure of Kiara's hand on his forearm. He looked down at his wife. Kiara's eyes were clear, the fear replaced by a cold, resonant clarity. She wasn't the 5-year-old girl waiting by the red gate anymore. She was the woman who had conquered his heart and his empire. She shook her head slowly, a silent plea for him not to become the monster her mother claimed he was. "She isn't worth your soul, Halenwa," Kiara whispered, her voice like silk over steel. "And she isn't worth the blood on your hands." Halenwa let out a long, ragged breath, the lethal tension slowly bleeding out of his shoulders. He sheathed his knife with a sharp, final click. He realized that killing Helen would give her too much importance. It would make her a martyr in the twisted narrative of her own mind. Instead, he would give her the one thing she feared more than death, the absolute, crushing weight of the truth. "Tawan," Halenwa called out, his voice returning to a cold, boardroom authority. His lead strategist stepped out of the shadows, holding a tablet that glowed with data. "Everything is recorded, sir. The wire transfers to the thugs, the disguised voice recordings, the DNA from the hideout, and the GPS tracking from her apartment. We have enough to ensure she never sees a sunrise from outside a cell." Halenwa looked back at Helen, his expression one of pure, clinical disgust. "I am the Dragon of Soul, Helen. I don't need to kill you to ruin you. I am handing you over to the law, but not as a victim. I am handing you over as a ghost. Every judge, every lawyer, and every guard in this country will know exactly what you did to your own flesh and blood. You will spend the rest of your life in a concrete room, and the only thing you will have to keep you company is the memory of the billion-dollar life you threw away because you were too small to love." As the police, called by Halenwa's legal team to ensure every detail was by the book, swarmed the building, Helen was dragged away. She didn't leave with dignity. She left screaming, a hollow, bitter woman whose greed had finally consumed her. Halenwa turned his back on the chaos, lifting Kiara into his arms once more. He carried her out of the rusted graveyard and into the crisp morning air. The sun was beginning to rise over the Han River, painting the skyline in hues of gold and lavender. When they reached the penthouse, the world felt different. The burden of the past had finally been lifted. Kiara stood on the balcony, the wind catching the bronze silk of her ruined gown, looking out at the city she now helped rule. Halenwa stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. "It's over, Kiara," he murmured, his chin resting on her shoulder. "The streets can't reach you anymore. Your mother can't reach you. You are home." Kiara leaned back into him, the warmth of his body a shield against every cold memory she had ever carried. She looked at the ring on her finger, the blue diamond that reflected the morning sky, and realized that her story wasn't about the girl who was abandoned. It was about the queen who was found. "I'm not just home, Halenwa," she said, turning in his arms to look into the dark, protective eyes she adored. "I'm free." Under the rising sun of a new day, the Mafia boss and his street queen shared a kiss that held no shadows, only the promise of a future where they would never have to walk alone again.